Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the Paul Lerner Memorial Lecture. Paul Lerner was a beloved member of this society. He valued the individual. He took into account empiricism and test scores, but he valued the individual and the individual's life story. And I am delighted to introduce to you today the Paul Lerner Memorial Lecture presenter, Dr. Dan McAdams. Dr. McAdams is the Henry Wade Rogers Professor of Psychology and Professor of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. He has chaired the Departments of Psychology and the Department of Human Development and Social Policy at Northwestern. He's the director of the Foley Center for the Study of Lives. His work at the center on narrative approaches to studying human lives, a methodology that places stories and storytelling at the center of personality, has been grant-funded continuously since 1997 by major foundation grants. He's taught numerous courses in personality, including personality psychology, adult development and aging, theories of personality and development, and psychology of life stories. He's won numerous awards, and I'm only going to mention a few because we would be here all morning long. He won the Henry A. Murray Award from the APA for research on personality and the study of lives, the Theodore Sarbin Award for contributions to theoretical and philosophical psychology, the Jack Block Award from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology for career contributions to the study of personality. He's a fellow of the APA Division 8 in the American Psychological Society and served on the executive committee of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology and is a founding member of the Association for Research in Personality. His research has been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker magazine, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Newsweek, Psychology Today, and even on Good Morning America. Dr. McAdams has published over 200 articles and book chapters in 6 books and served on several editorial boards for journals in personality. Although he's conducted research in many areas of personality and lifespan development, he's most known for his theoretical and empirical work on the concepts of self and identity in contemporary American society and on themes of power, intimacy, redemption, and generativity across the adult lifespan. His life story theory of human identity has helped both researchers and clinicians to more fully understand that adults in our society develop a sense of unity, cohesion, and purpose by constructing and internalizing self-defining stories known as personal myths. His 2006 book, The Redemptive Self, Stories Americans Live By, covers over 15 years of his work that charts the psychology of American identity as expressed in cultural and historical American texts and images and in life stories of productive American adults. In 2011, he published George W. Bush and the Redemptive Dream, a psychological portrait, and his more recent book, The Art and Science of Personality and Development, in 2015. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Dan McAdams.
Thank you. It's an honor to give the Paul Lerner Memorial Lecture. I did not know Paul Lerner, but I have learned a bit about him over the past week or so. I knew of his work. I never met the man, and I do feel a kindred connection, not only in terms of his warmth and his compassion, but also his work in the study of lives and the psychodynamic tradition in using projective assessment to understand lives. A big event for me in my life was reading Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents as a freshman in college, and I think that's what turned me in the direction of psychology, so coming in through the psychodynamic tradition and early research on the TAT. So I feel close to him, even though I didn't know him, and I feel close to all of you. I've been a member of the society, although not all that active, I have to admit, for a couple of decades now, and it's really great to be here. So let me start with shameless self-promotion. These two books, The Redemptive Self, Stories Americans Live By, and The Art and Science of Personality Development, they contain the ideas that frame my talk this afternoon or this morning. And so I'll refer back to them. The first big idea to get across here is projected, or it's developed further in the Art and Science of Personality Development, is a conception of personality writ large. And this is a conception that is growing in influence in the field of personality and developmental psychology today. And it essentially views the person, or views personality, in terms of three layers or lines of development moving over time. And this isn't really stages. These are layers or lines across time. And the first layer or line refers to fundamental temperament or dispositional traits that start to show up, as we all know, even in the first few days of life: positive emotionality, negative emotionality. And this line of development eventually leads to a consolidation of fundamental dispositional traits like extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, these basic dimensions of the social actor. And they speak to a particular actor's style of interacting in the social world. What kind of an actor am I? Am I outgoing? Am I withdrawn? Am I somebody who comes on strong? Am I relatively meek? Am I somebody who worries a lot? Am I somebody you can count on as a hard-working individual, that being conscientiousness? These fundamental dispositional traits, they speak to our social reputations as social animals living together in groups. And this is really basic, and we see it traced along from birth to our last years. But there is more to personality and personality development than our fundamental dispositional traits. I mean, you can know, for example, that George W. Bush was a flaming extrovert and very low on openness to experience. That's interesting as a first sort of brush in terms of his personality, and it's probably something that everybody who knew him, whether friend or foe, would agree to in terms of these kind of basic observable dispositions. But like, what's going on inside the man's head? What are his goals and values? When you get to that kind of thing, you're moving, I argue, to a second layer of personality. It's not like deep and dark and mysterious and unconscious necessarily, but it's not really there on the surface of our social activity. You have to get inside a person's head to know what his values are, what his or her goals are. And here we're talking, therefore, about a second line of development, the development of a person as a motivated agent. Okay, so I wake up in the morning, and what is my motivational agenda? What am I trying to accomplish, short-term and long-term? You can't necessarily tell that kind of thing from observing the social actor. You have to go beyond. And the argument in the Art and Science of Personality Development is that the motivated agent kind of comes to the party a little later than does the social actor. We start to see the emergence of this level of personality in the grade school years. Once kids start to understand that, in fact, yes, I am an agent. I have wishes and I have goals and I have plans and I can act on them over time in order to accomplish valued ends. Okay, so 2-year-olds don't wake up in the morning with a motivational agenda, right? But 10-year-olds do, and we all do. And so this second line of personality development, the motivated agent, sort of kicks in, and in a sense, personality thickens over time to accommodate this second level. The third level is the level I'm going to talk about today mainly, and that's the level of what I call the autobiographical author. We go from actor to agent to author in this scheme. And actually, that's not quite right. It's not like you leave the actor behind. You add the author and the agent to the actor as personality thickens ever more. And research suggests, and a good deal of theory, that beginning, say, in our teenage years or maybe emerging adulthood, we start to become historians of the self, start to understand our lives as histories in which we play main roles. And so who was I as a child? Who am I today? Where is my life going? What kind of a story can I construct in my social and cultural world to make sense of who I was, am, and hope to be in the long haul? That's the self, the person from the perspective of the autobiographical author, actor, agent, author, the thickening of personality with development. Now let me say a bit more about the author here. The central concept is what is today called narrative identity, and it refers to an internalized and evolving story of the self that explains how I came to be the person I am becoming. We think about the internalized life story here, the narrative identity, as involving a reconstruction of the past, whereby I select out certain memories, high points, low points, and so forth, that seem to have a certain kind of self-defining quality to them. So I reconstruct my past, most of which, by the way, I've forgotten anyway. Just a few things stand out. And then I imagine the future, and this projection of the future connecting to the autobiographical past creates, ideally, a narrative that has some semblance, at least, of coherence, some understanding of who I was, who I am today, and who I may be going forward. So I study narrative identity mainly. I traffic in the world of life stories. I collect stories from people. My students and I do this. But we do it in a relatively formalized way. We typically use a life story interview, something sort of like this, whereby a person sits down for the interview session and essentially is asked a series of questions about his or her life. Now, these folks know what they're getting into ahead of time. They know they've signed up for some kind of study about autobiographical recollections, about the self as a storyteller and all that kind of thing. What they don't expect is that it will be so emotionally, I think, riveting for them. Many people get very carried away with these interviews. They cry. They find these to be emotionally, sometimes exhausting kinds of experiences. But at the same time, afterwards, almost to a person will say, yes, this was a meaningful thing. I enjoyed this. And oh, by the way, you're even going to pay me for it. That's great, but actually you don't need to do that. It was just so great to talk to you for an hour and a half or two, and all you did was listen and affirm my story. I mean, how often does that happen? So it begins with asking the person to think about your life as if it were kind of like a novel, divided up into chapters, and say a little bit about what the main chapters are. And then let's zero in on a few key moments that stand out in the text. A high point, say, the best moment of your life. What was it? The birth of my first child, perhaps. A home run I hit when I was 15 in Little League that just was so wonderful. My father was there. Everybody was joyous. Who knows what they are, but there's lots of different kinds of high points that come out. If you've been blessed with a life that has many of them, you have to pick one and talk about it in some detail. What were you thinking and feeling in the event? What happened? And even comment on its meaning. Like, why do you think you picked that event? What is its significance? And then a low point, of course, the worst thing that has ever happened in your life. This is a difficult thing to talk about. A turning point event. And then there are a series of other questions that basically zero in on episodic memory, key moments that stand out. Who are some of the important characters in your story? Where is the narrative going? What does the future look like? What are your hopes and aspirations for the future? Most of the people I interview are in their midlife years. They're in what you might see as the prime of life, although they don't always see it that way. But they're in the middle. And so there is a big past to go forward, but thankfully there is a fairly expansive future still for them. People in their 30s, 40s, 50s, early 60s say that's kind of the chunk of time or the life course that I focus in on. Towards the end of the interview, we ask people a little bit about their personal beliefs and values, religious beliefs, political beliefs, social and ethical sorts of frameworks. And finally, the last question, thinking back over this now 2-hour interview that you participated in, and it's video, it's taped, not video, audio taped and later transcribed. Now that you think back on it, do you, the narrator, discern a theme or a motif that stands out? And sometimes these expressions are extraordinarily insightful, or we think they are, which often translates into, yeah, that's what I would have said in that situation. And in other cases, people will throw some interesting curveballs at you and provide some concluding comments that are surprising. Now, let me give you an example of the kind of data we deal with in these studies here, and I'm going to talk about one particular participant's life story, just one key scene from it, a turning point event in the life of a man that we'll call Jerome Johnson. He's a retired African-American. He's in his early 60s. He spends a great deal of time and energy these days, or when we interviewed him, which was quite a while ago, doing volunteer work for children and youth. In fact, that's one of the reasons we're interviewing this guy, or we did interview this guy. This is in a study that sought to illustrate or exemplify the stories told by especially caring and productive midlife adults, what Erik Erikson would describe as highly generative adults. Johnson happened to score very high on a self-report measure of generativity. The turning point scene in his life story, as he tells it today, or as he told it then, was a chance encounter with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in the mid-1960s. A year or two before he was assassinated, King came to a small city in the Midwest to speak to civic and religious leaders and to rally citizens, black and white, for civil rights. Jerome Johnson was assigned to be one of King's bodyguards for this local visit. Johnson was a black policeman in his early 30s, an ambitious man who had been a football star in high school and who completed a tour of duty in the U.S. Air Force. Johnson dreamed of becoming a police chief, but he was frustrated. No black man in that town at that point in the late 60s had ever been promoted to sergeant, let alone chief. And Johnson's fellow officers, he was very popular on the force, both black and white officers, counseled him against taking the promotional exam. His friends told him that he should be satisfied with what he had. He was seriously, however, thinking about quitting the force. I was thinking of leaving the police force because I felt it was a hopeless thing that a black could ever become chief. Johnson said in a life story interview that we conducted over 30 years later, so he's 60 now, looking back on his early 30s, but then he says, my life turned around. It was at the time I was assigned to be a bodyguard for Martin Luther King, and he was here, I think, maybe 2 or 3 days, and so I spent some time with him. And we started talking, King and I told him how frustrated I was about the fact that no black had ever been promoted. Maybe it's time to move on, I told him, because I didn't see there was anything that was going to change at all. And King, just said a couple of things, just very briefly. He said, never give up. And that was basically the end of the conversation. And I thought about that before. it's not like nobody had ever said never give up. There's nothing profound there. But when he said it to me, and the way he said, keep the faith, and never give up, and never stop dreaming the dream, well, I held on to that, and things changed. He turned me around from walking out the door. Now, notice the structure of Jerome Johnson's turning point scene. We treat each of these scenes as a piece of narrative text, okay? And so how does the scene begin? It begins in hopelessness, or at least a fair amount of discouragement, but the situation is transformed rather dramatically by a fortuitous meeting. In simple terms, there is a movement in the scene from a negative emotional situation to a positive outcome. And I call that movement a redemption sequence. Now, as we learn later in the interview, Johnson eventually did take the promotional exam, and after many years, he did become the first black chief on that force. So now in retirement, he tells a life story that is filled with scenes like the one I just described, what we would call redemption sequences. In the worst days of the Great Depression, for example, late 1930s, his family has no money, as he recalls the event, and it's Christmas time, and they're sitting around the tree kind of like depressed, as he remembers it. And then a neighbor stops by, knocks on the door, and delivers turkey and presents. Or at a high school basketball game, opposing white players call Jerome a nigger. His mother is there. She's in the gym. She runs out of the gym in tears. Bad event. But Jerome says, yeah, it was bad, but that event, it toughened me up. Again and again in the story, the protagonist endures suffering at the beginning of a scene, but is somehow rewarded in the end. We call this a redemption sequence. A bad or emotionally negative, sad, frightening, humiliating scene turns good or emotionally positive. The bad is salvaged, saved, redeemed by a positive outcome or turn of events. These come in at least two varieties, redemption sequences, both illustrated in the case of Jerome Johnson. The first is when there is a movement in the text, or in the plot, if you will, as imagined in real time, from negative to positive, as was the case, for example, in the Martin Luther King incident, okay? I was in a bad mood, I was depressed, I was thinking of quitting the force. King shows up, tells me never to give up, I feel good, all right? Now, let's face it, he did eventually become the police chief. So he's talking about this 30 years later, and he's pointing this out as a key moment in his life. He might not have picked it had he not become chief. Memory is always reconstructive. That memory means something very different to him today because he became chief than it might have meant had he not become chief. Okay, so that's one kind of redemption sequence. In real time, there's a move from positive to negative. Just as frequent in occurrence are redemption sequences of a second type. And these are a little bit more like the basketball scene, okay? Nothing positive happened in the moment. It wasn't like after the white players yelled out the racial epithet, Johnson then won the game with a dramatic last shot. That would have been a redemption sequence, sort of. But no, that's not what happened. We don't know what happened in the game. But years later, he looks back on it and he says, yeah, it was bad, but it toughened me up. So there's an after-the-fact interpretation made, a kind of lesson or meaning drawn from the event to suggest that I grew or I was strengthened or something positive happened, not at the time, granted, but down the road. There was something positive in that particular thing. Not that it was good that it happened, for crying out loud. Many redemption sequences come from horrible events, and you wish they would have never happened. But horrible events happen. I mean, it's not good for any of us that horrible events happen. In a weird way, it's sort of good for my research, and it's odd to say, but I mean, I kind of traffic in misery here, and when bad things happen to people, all of us, unfortunately, and by the time you're in your midlife years, like Jerome Johnson, you're going to have quite a few. But how do you narrate them? Okay, Johnson uses a lot of redemption sequences. And by the way, I should point out, I don't have time to talk about it, but it's not like everything in his interview is redemptive. I mean, there were some really bad events in there that didn't get turned into positive things, but he had a lot of them. Johnson's data are part of a study. I'm not sure you can see the yellow on that real well, but this was part of a study a number of years ago we did, in which we basically had two groups of participants. We had a bunch of folks like Jerome Johnson who scored really high on our measures of generativity, and then there was a matching sample of less generative adults. And these bars just refer in a very gross way to the density of redemptive imagery as coded in the texts. I mean, we ultimately content analyze these texts, and we come up with numerical scores, and as you can see here, in a very straightforward way. I mean, the people high on generativity, the generative group, if you will, they've got a lot more of this redemption stuff going on in their life story interviews than do people low in generativity. The finding has been replicated many times. Redemption sequences are also linked up, perhaps not surprisingly here, to self-report measures of psychological well-being and self-esteem, negatively associated with depression. Okay, not sure what's causing what here, but people who are report at least that they are enjoying life and have a high level of well-being, social, psychological well-being, tend to create narratives that highlight this redemptive notion. And by the way, I don't have a slide on this, it's not just that their stories, in fact, it's not that their stories are happier necessarily, but actually we've coded for that, and that's not what actually distinguishes the groups or connects to psychological well-being so strongly. It's the narration of suffering, lots of suffering, and showing that oftentimes positive outcomes come from that. This idea of coding things for redemption sequences, there's a lot of work on this going on now in personality and social psychology. I just feature one quick study here done by Will Dunlop, a young personality psychologist at the University of California, Riverside, in which he essentially coded the narratives told by alcoholics who were in a recovery program for the extent to which they described their experience of a last drink in redemptive terms. I don't know all the details of the study right now, but essentially what he finds is that imagery in the accounts told by the men and women, mostly men, I think, who had abused alcohol for many years, the density of the redemption imagery in the narrative accounts of their last drink ends up predicting length of sobriety in that particular group. Now, this idea of a redemption sequence, it often comes in a package with a set of other themes, 5 of them to be exact. And we consider, I talk about these in my book, The Redemptive Self, as sort of like comprising a certain type or kind of life narrative. And no one's life fits this thing exactly the way I describe it here, but certain life stories get closer to it than do others. So let me kind of talk about this idealized form. Imagine this as a kind of generalized script for a life narrative. Again, nobody fits it perfectly, but some life stories get a little closer to it than do others. 5 themes, one of which I've already talked about, the redemption sequence. Okay, so let's take them one at a time. The first one's called early advantage. How does the life story begin? How would you begin your life story? How would you narrate your earliest experiences, okay? The story I'm interested in here is one in which the narrator points to an advantage that she or he had early on in life. Perhaps mom liked me the best, or perhaps I had a skill or a gift that other people recognized. All of us can probably come up with something, but would we make a big deal out of that in talking about the beginnings of our life stories? Turns out highly generative adults, as we'll see in a bit, they love to talk this way about their lives, as if to suggest early on they felt, as they remember it now, age 50, 60, they remember feeling early on that they were special in a good way. Okay? And there's lots of different ways this can happen. One man talks about it in terms of his name. My name's David. That's the most important thing you need to know. And I go, okay, that's great to know, but so why is that important? He goes, because in my family, going back generations, okay, when you were named David, all right, typically the firstborn son, a great deal was expected of you. He actually saw the name as a burden as well as a gift, but nonetheless something that marked him for distinction. At the same time, I realize as a protagonist in the story and as the narrator telling it years later that not everybody else is chosen or advantaged. A lot of people have a really bad time in life. There's suffering, there's oppression, there's pain. Well, again, everybody in the room knows that all too well from your own lives and the lives of others. But would you feature memories early on in your life story that focused on the suffering of other people? I was a 4th grader. I went to the Baptist church. Little white boy at that church, and African Americans are moving into the neighborhood. The leaders of the church decide, hey, let's reroute the Sunday morning bus that picks up those little white kids in the early 1960s. Let's reroute it so it doesn't go down those streets where the blacks are moving in. And the kid says, and the adult, now looking back as to when he was a kid, says, yeah, I remember that when I was in 3rd or 4th grade. That bothered me a lot. Okay? Why bring that in? We didn't ask for that kind of a memory, but highly generative adults will often tell you these kinds of stories, like Jerome Johnson will tell you these kinds of stories, where they feel early on they were special, they were lucky, others aren't. Or another way to put it, I am the gifted protagonist who journeys forth into a dangerous world. Okay? We all know the world's dangerous, all right? But it's almost as if this story underscores that at the beginning. You're lucky, the world is bad. You're lucky, and the world is bad. Therefore, if that's kind of how you see things, maybe it makes sense that you would feel compelled to try to make a positive difference in the world, that you might see yourself as somebody needing to be what Erik Erikson described as a highly generative adult. Because after all, you're fortunate, and the world needs you. They will describe what I call moral depth and steadfastness. Highly generative adults like Jerome Johnson love to talk to you about, in their life stories, about their clear values. You know, like, well, we all have values, but like, mine are really clear, man. And I've had them for a long time, and I believe in these things. And okay, they may not be your values. That's okay. That's cool. but this is what I believe, and I know it, and it guides my life. All right, so there's this sort of like very heavy, strong value orientation to the story. Typically, my values are developed in these stories in my teenage years. And then bad things happen. Well, bad things always happen in a life story. You never know when they're going to happen. But usually, more often than not, good things follow. Redemption sequences, I've talked about that. And now as I look to the future in this life story, what do I see? Well, I could see a lot of bad things happen. It might be that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, but not in my part of it, not in my little world. In my part of the world, good things are going to happen because I'm making a positive difference. There's going to be growth. There's going to be positive outcomes. I've got likely a high level of, a high number of pro-social goals for the future. Let me straighten this out here. Okay, there we go. Now let me get some data here that sort of support the idea that this kind of a story, albeit a general script that doesn't apply exactly to anybody's life, but telling a life story that sort of resembles this kind of thing tends to be associated with some positive things in life. So how would you, first of all, go about coding this? This is kind of how we did it in a recent study, and I think it gives you a sense of the kind of work I do here. First thing to note is that this is pretty labor-intensive stuff. We got these long interviews here, and in this case, we've divided up, not the whole interview, but a good part of the interview into essentially 12 segments here. Okay, so there's the opening part of the interview where you talk about just the life story chapters. There's a high point scene, a low point scene, a turning point scene, a positive memory from childhood, a negative memory from childhood, and on it goes into the last question here, a future life project. So these are 12 opportunities that the participant has to talk about key events or ideas in his or her life story. Each one, you might go on for a few minutes. In the case of life story chapters, for many minutes. And so these are typed out and transcribed, and we work with the texts. We go from one scene to the next. And so in a particular study I'm going to tell you about in a moment, where we had 100, I believe about 160 participants, all late midlife adults in their late 50s here, you find, you might get interviews that are, when typed up, are like 30, 35 single-space pages of text. So I don't know how many words that is. I've got the number somewhere, but it's a lot of reading to do. And so you chunk it into these particular segments, and then for each segment, across the top, you're looking for one of those 5 themes. These are the 5 themes, again: early advantage, suffering of others, moral depth, steadfastness, redemption, and pro-social goals for the future. Those are going across the top. And so effectively, in reading the interview, you are making a decision for each segment as to whether or not that particular theme was there. And so here are hypothetical data from a participant, and we see here, well, out of the 12 scenes, there were 2 in which the rater said, yeah, there was an early advantage mentioned, life story chapters and positive childhood scene. There's 2 for a sensitivity of suffering of others, low point and turning point. Looks like there's 6 instances here of moral steadfastness, and so it goes. And so there's a profile for each participant based on the coding of the whole life story text. These simple numbers just get added up, and voila, you've got quantitative data that you can deal with. All right, so the study that these data come from, again, 160 late midlife adults. It's called the Foley Longitudinal Study of Adulthood. We're still doing this study at Northwestern. These are community adults. There's nothing special about them in terms they're not clinical sampling in any way, but they're not sampled for distinction either. These are folks who basically we got in the community who volunteered for our work. In this particular study, we're focusing a lot on, exclusively on white and African-American participants. So we've oversampled African-American participants to the point where they're almost 50% of the participants are African-American, and a little over 50% are Euro-American. Okay, so I'm going to present just one big data slide here. Let me walk you through it. The upshot being that these themes that I've described, making up this redemptive story, the 5 themes, tend to be strongly associated with 2 of these self-report measures here and not with a third, or 3 of these self-report measures and not with a fourth. So what's that about? All right, so my self-report measures here are generativity. I've talked about that already. Haven't really given you examples of this particular self-report measure, but it assesses the Ericksonian idea of the extent to which you are focused on making a positive difference for the next generation. I mean, that's my other talk I could give on generativity. I mean, it's a concept dear to my heart. I think it's one of the greatest concepts in the psychodynamic tradition. Erickson, others have written about it. I don't think there's anything more important, really, in midlife than to find a way to be generative. I mean, why are we here, right? To try to leave something behind, something positive through our children, if we don't have children, through our institutions, through our schools, whatever it is, to pass on something to the next generation. Many of you are involved in that as teachers and clinicians and so forth, so this is not a surprise to you, but there's a lot of variation in generativity in the population, and so we've got that construct in here. We've got something called public service motivation, which is essentially an assessment of the extent to which you are involved in public service of various kinds, community activism and so forth. There's a solid measure of psychological well-being, Carol Riff's measure of well-being, and then there's a depression inventory, the BDI. And what you see here are correlations and beta coefficients, and essentially what we're looking at is the relationship between each of these 5 themes that comprise this redemptive script, if you will, the 5 themes I described a minute ago, relationship between the density of those themes in the life story interview on the one hand, and these self-report measures on the other. The regression equations for the betas, they control for a bunch of things like race, class, income. There are a number of factors that are controlled there. When you control for them, the relationships really aren't all that different than what you see with the correlations. And essentially the story here is, especially with generativity, a fairly strong association between narrating your life as this big redemption story kind of thing with the 5 themes on the one hand and generativity on the other. The composite index at the end, at the far right, simply reflects to the idea of adding up the standard scores of the 5 themes to make one big fat score that says how much of this stuff do you have in general in your life story. It's highly associated with generativity, also with public service motivation, and with psychological well-being. Not really associated, though, with depression, interestingly. And so I've written a lot and thought a lot about, well, like, why is this kind of story so tightly connected to having a generative life and reports of psychological well-being? And my view of it sort of goes like this, that being a highly caring and productive generative adult, a guy like Jerome Johnson, this is hard work. There are many other things you could do with your life, right, than be generative. I mean, why focus so much of your energy on the next generation? It's likely to bring you misery, okay? If your generativity comes through raising children, I don't have to tell you that that doesn't always work out perfectly. Or maybe it comes through public service of some kind, involvement in your school district, or maybe you are a big politico and you campaign or you canvass and you support political candidates, local or national. There's lots of different ways to be generative. People are quite ingenious in our society in finding ways. But if you do that kind of thing, rather than all the other kinds of things you could be doing, I mean, you could be shopping, right? You could be staying home watching television. And sometimes it's very difficult to be generative. Maybe you can't do it, but it's hard work. And so I think you need a good story if you've got this kind of thing. I mean, I love to quote King Lear here. He had problems with generativity with his 3 daughters. And he said at one point, he yelled out, "Sharper than a serpent's tooth is the ingratitude of a child." Okay, well, problems in generativity led Lear to madness. There was probably also an organic thing going on there too, but I mean, Lear clearly wasn't going down a path. He wanted to be generative, it didn't work out so well. Generativity is hard. You need a good story. What kind of story? How about one of these stories, like the redemptive self kind of story? Why is that good? Well, first of all, it sort of makes you be generative because it says, come on, Mom liked you the best. You had some advantage early on. Don't forget, you were chosen, you were special. All right? And you knew from an early date that the world is a dangerous place. Bad things happen to other people. So it's almost like it's your moral duty, man. You've got to get out there and be a generative person. You're special. The world needs you. Moreover, you've got these solid values that, like kind of support this. We all know that generativity is hard work. We all know that you're going to be disappointed along the way. But look at your life story. Bad things happen. Remember that thing in the gym with your mom there and she ran out in tears? Remember those bad Christmases where you didn't have any money? Yeah, bad things happen in your life. They continue to happen. But more often than not, something positive comes out of it. So you've kind of convinced yourself you've got this redemptive story, and that kind of story, I think, helps to support a generative life. It gives you the sustenance to be a highly generative person. Now, there are some downsides to this story. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. I think there's some interesting things to say about in that regard. But I think you can see why it might be a narrative that would work for some people to support a generative life. In conclusion, I want to say a few things about the relationship here between culture and generativity before I open it up for questions. A lot of us believe, maybe not the people in this room, but I think many folks, once they get this idea of a life story, okay, I've got a life story. I'm an author. I'm an autobiographer. We all have a story. It's my story. I made this story. I created it. It reflects my life as I have lived it. And who can argue? Surely it does. But at the same time, what I think many of us don't realize is that we are just like shameless plagiarizers when it comes to life narratives, okay? We don't just come up with these cool new ideas like this idea that, positive things come from suffering. I discovered that idea. Well, no, you didn't. That's been around for a long time, thousands of years. Or what about this idea, I started with nothing. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. Nobody went to college. People barely finished high school. I was the first in my family to go to college, right? And now here I am, I get to speak to you folks. That is rags to riches, okay? That is upward mobility, at least for me. That's a powerful narrative for me, okay? But did I invent that? Well, there was Benjamin Franklin. He had a pretty good one 200 plus years ago. This idea of a Horatio Alger story, pull yourself up from your straps, it may be a myth. It may be that many of us don't have the great opportunity to do that, but it's a powerful narrative out there. People know it, and they incorporate it, they appropriate it into their own life stories. There is an interesting kind of co-authorship of life narrative that happens. The co-authors are the author himself, herself, the individual, and the culture and all the forces within culture that shape and that essentially sometimes set the agenda for what kind of a story can even be told. Like if I sat here right now and told you, this group, which is probably a fairly secular group here, I told you the reason I became a psychologist is that when I was 18, God spoke to me directly on a Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock for a half hour. And it was clear, and I wrote it down in my diary, and this is what he said. And ever since then, I have been committed to psychology. If I told you that story, I don't know how this group would go for that. I don't know if I'd get my honorarium check, to tell you the truth. If I told that kind of story in a different context, maybe one down the road at the Willow Creek Church, I might get applause. That might be the kind of story that would really resonate in that cultural context. And so culture, different contexts of culture, shape stories. They are involved in it. When it comes to redemptive stories of the sort I've described here with these themes, there are at least 4 wonderful models, although they all have their problems, that are well known for Americans, I think, and they may go beyond our culture too. Stories of atonement, for example, the move from sin to salvation. I mean, I don't know how many, I think 40 million or more evangelical Christians in the United States, and many of them, I grew up in that tradition, I should mention, many of them have these stories for their lives in which being saved is the key turning moment, and they recall it. I'll give you an example of somebody like that, George W. Bush. Okay? As he tells his life narrative, there was an amazing event that occurred. It's April 4th, 1984 or 86, I have to go back and look, at a Holiday Inn coffee shop where he sits down with an evangelist, a man named Arthur Blessett, believe it or not, and they walk through a prayer whereby George W. brings Jesus into his heart. Now, it didn't turn things around immediately, but it is a key event in marking the redemptive move in that man's life from, as many of you may know, years of waywardness and alcohol abuse and irresponsibility in his 20s and 30s, that event, along with marrying Laura earlier and giving up drinking on his 40th birthday later, those three events mark a move of what looks a lot like atonement to me. It also has a little bit of some other themes in it too. But again, a story that many of us know. Or what about rags to riches? I've talked about that, okay? The American dream is often called that. Stories of upward social mobility. These are all stories that go from negative to positive. Stories of liberation, from slavery to freedom. Now, nobody in the room here probably has ever experienced slavery literally, okay? But maybe you use that as a trope for construing a certain part of your life, like that first marriage. I felt enslaved, I felt held down, and then I was liberated. Or I went through this period in my life where I had no dignity, where everybody was oppressing me, and then I broke out of it. Those are powerful stories. Many of us have them. We associate them with certain movements in our society, and they can also be appropriated to the individual. And finally, stories of recovery, and I put Oprah up there as a great example of this. These are a little different, but very, very powerful, where the movement here is to get back something that you lost. Okay, and George W. also has this in his life story. What he lost was sobriety, and what he lost was the calm, carefree, wholesome life he enjoyed in Midland, Texas. He lost it when he started drinking. That's what his story says. And then 22 years later, when he gave up drinking, he started to get it back. Okay, so what is this story about? It's moving from illness or sickness or addiction back to something you lost. Recovering your health, recovering your innocence, recovering your purity, whatever it might be, you want to get it back. Oprah up here because that's her life story to a certain extent, but more importantly, on her show at least, she used to do this, she's not as active now, but she encouraged people strongly to think about their lives this way, to construe their lives as this particular kind of narrative of redemption. So in closing, I want to say that the life stories we create that essentially layer over our traits and our goals and values, these life stories further thicken our personality as we move forward in the life course. There is a tremendous amount of variability in people's life stories, just as there is a tremendous amount of variability in traits and goals and values. I study the variability in life stories. One interesting variability issue here is the extent to which these stories connect to this notion of a redemptive self, those 5 themes I described. I believe that kind of story has a certain American cultural cachet, but there are others, and it leaves us with this idea that, yes, we do create stories, provide our lives with meaning and purpose, but we do so in a cultural context. Thank you. So it looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions, and so I see a hand right there. You have to shout out loud because my hearing is bad.
I was interested in your table that the regression weights stayed mostly significant, and I might have thought the redemption theme would have been a kind of single factor. Can you speak about why there might be additive effects across those different levels?
Yeah. It's a good question. You know, it's hard to. It's a funky thing we're doing here. We're treating these 5 themes almost as if they are individual test items. Okay, so you can get an alpha and all that kind of thing. But stories are weird that way. It's not like every story kind of converges on the construct, the way you expect items to do so in self-report. Speaking of, well, to get to your thing, the individual themes sometimes give you some power that you don't, some separate kind of, they account for separate variations. So here's an example. We actually followed these folks up over time, and we wanted to see not only do these redemptive self themes, do they predict psychological well-being and generativity at time 1? We see that in that slide that was up there. But what do they say about trajectories of well-being going forward? Well, it turns out that they don't predict an increase in well-being from time 1 to time 5, with the exception of one of those themes, moral steadfastness. For whatever reason, it stands out as a theme that not only is associated with generativity and well-being concurrently or contemporaneously, but also predicts an increase, a trajectory in well-being, social well-being at least, over time. Why would that theme do it and not the other four? I think each of the themes has its own kind of integrity. At the same time, I didn't report these data, but they are mildly positively intercorrelated with each other. Yes, sir.
The evaluation form.
Oops, did I not do what I said I was going to do?
In the lives of U.S. presidents of Barack Obama and George W. Bush. You mentioned George W. Bush.
Yes. In the, I don't have my slides up here anymore, but in the, oh yeah, I do. In the opening slide, the new version of the Redemptive Self, 2013, there it is on the left, has a chapter in there about Obama versus Bush. And what I'm pitting here is two different kinds of redemptive narratives. It's going to be interesting in this next election. I mean, the candidates have very different kinds of stories out there, especially Mr. Trump. I mean, like, I'm not sure it kind of fits what we typically expect in terms of presidential candidates' life narratives, but both George W. Bush and Barack Obama tell powerfully redemptive stories in which they go through, in which they track the move from suffering to enhancement. In Bush's case, as I suggested, it's a story mainly of atonement and recovery. In Obama's case, it's a story that he witnessed more so than he lived. Okay, and that is the story of liberation, a progressive movement from slavery, but not just slavery. I mean, also like it encompasses women's rights and gays and a lot of oppressed groups. And it's the idea of the arc of justice is long, the arc of history is long and bends towards justice, attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. That's kind of a motto for Barack Obama's life narrative, as he describes it in his autobiography, Dreams from My Father. And so he'll say, it's not like I went through this bad stuff, okay, but I identify with this. I feel like I'm part of this broad historical narrative of liberation. And it's a story that for some people is very, very inspiring, as is George W. Bush's story for some people, as very inspiring, the conversion story. Those two groups tend not to have a lot in common, except that they both, I think, have many of us Americans, we really like these redemptive stories. They come in all kinds of different flavors. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out in the upcoming election, how those life narratives, I don't know how that's going to work, to tell you the truth. But anyway, yes, sir.
First, I want to thank you for such an exciting talk.
Thank you.
My question is this. The people that you study with the generative stories and so on, and the relationship
Redemptive stories.
Redemptive stories
Yeah,
to
sure.
positive mental health. These appear to be naturally occurring redemptive stories. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about what you have studied teaching people to reframe experiences in that cast that could increase adjustment and mental health.
Yeah, so the question is about, like, what about having express efforts, as in therapy, to get people to narrate their lives in a more redemptive way. I think to a certain extent that's what happens in many forms of therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy being the one I know best, because all my colleagues in the clinical program, they do CBT and they talk about it all the time. So there's all kinds of methods there for reframing and trying to get people to sort of develop stories about themselves that move from the negative to the positive. It's kind of general. So I think to a certain extent there's a lot of sort of lore and wisdom in the clinical world about the kinds of stories that we feel are health promoting. There are also efforts in social psychology to expressly get people to like reframe not only moments in their own lives, but like historical events in redemptive terms. There's an interesting line of research among social psychologists interested in race relations and relations between groups that are in conflict, where they argue that I'm not sure exactly how it goes, but if you get the participants to narrate conflict in a potentially redemptive way, it leads to a more kind of conciliatory approach to social interactions. I'm not doing justice to that literature, but some of it has been done by a woman named Jennifer Richardson, a social psychologist at Northwestern, and there's some others. So there are some efforts to do that kind of thing formally in social psychology, but I think sort of in clinical work, a lot of folks do it.
Thank you very much. I'm curious, I don't use this technique anymore because my work is different now, but I remember in my training I was introduced to Adlerian early recollections, and I remember being blown away by the same recollection being done at the time of intake and then after psychotherapy, and it was startling to me how the same recollection could change dramatically based on the growth that occurred in psychotherapy, and that got me wondering about the longitudinal work that you're doing and whether or not you're looking at how people's recollections or narratives about their lives change as they continue to develop and grow.
Yeah, you read our grant proposal. I mean, that's what we wanted to do, and we even cited Adler. Yes, very interested in that phenomenon, and we finally have some longitudinal data to do that. So in this fully longitudinal study that I alluded to, we give people life story interviews 3 times, year 1, year 5, and year 9. But we haven't done the year 9 yet. By year 9, they'll be like in their mid-60s, sort of retirement age, and it's pretty much the same interview. And about from year 1 to year 5, I think there's about 20% of a repetition on events. So the kind of thing you described with the client there, where it's the same scene, but it's told a second time. And then the question is, how is it told the second time? Is it told differently? And in this case, these folks are not going through any kind of formal therapy or whatever, so I don't know what kinds of longitudinal change will indeed show up. But I mean, you know, it's the kind of thing you would expect if you see memory as reconstructive, that your current functioning, as Adler brilliantly suggested, your current functioning, or in his case, your current style of life, feeds back, if you will, or shapes your memory of the past. So the past is always up for grabs. We are like historians trying to make sense of these events. Certain things don't change. You know, it's like, well, I mean, Jerome Johnson really, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. And by the way, we did check out his story. He did become the police chief in that town, so that part seems to be quite valid. In fact, I think most of it indeed is very veridical. But so let's say he had that particular moment with Martin Luther King Jr. I wonder how he narrated it in his 40s, 50s, and 60s. My guess is that the meaning changed. Surely his becoming police chief had a huge effect on all kinds of aspects of the life story. It's kind of like, I think, with these highly generative adults, it's almost as if they wake up one day, this is exaggerated, but it's like, wow, whoa, I'm a highly generative adult. I mean, they don't use that term, but they see that they're out there, like, I'm doing stuff, I'm out in the world, I'm a caring and productive person, and isn't that great? How did I get to be this way? Maybe mom liked me the best, okay? You know, and now that I think about it, I was sensitized to suffering at an early age, right? So it could be that the story is, in some ways, an after-the-fact narrative justification for the things that you've already done. At the same time, the story probably also motivates what you do. So it's an interesting dialectic there. Yes, ma'am.
Any gender differences in themes or the correlations?
Gender differences. In that particular study, there are very few gender differences with respect to the themes or the correlations. Things seem to work out pretty much the same for women and men. And that's the one slight variation on that in the past is that we have seen that women tend, on our self-report measures, not the narratives, but on the self-report measures, women sometimes score a little higher than men on generativity, but it's not a big difference. We do get interesting race ethnicity differences, however, in this data set. And to put it straightforwardly, the African Americans have way more of this redemption stuff. Like on the moral steadfastness theme, it's like 2 to 1 in terms of the difference. But they do more redemption narration for all 5 of those themes across the board. It's statistically significant. They also tend to score a little higher in generativity. But the relationships between the themes and the self-reports do not differ as a function of race ethnicity. Yes?
Yeah, I'm curious, in that data set you showed, where? Oh, no, yeah, the where is it? Whatever. There, yeah. There's one non-correlation, which is between redemption scenes and public service motivation. Do you have an explanation or an understanding of that?
No. I don't know. That's good. Yeah, I mean, This public service motivation is an instrument that we don't really know a whole heck of a lot about. I mean, the construct validity for it is kind of minimal, whereas the generativity measure is really linked. But why would there be such a disparity on that particular theme? I have no explanation for that. You also see that it's not associated with early advantage either. Yeah, it's sort of like this redemptive self story. It's tailor-made to go with generativity. And that's what we've been doing for 20 years anyway. This is sort of a culmination, but we've done a lot of other studies that are kind of like this, trying to show, or not trying, but succeeding in showing that generativity and this redemption these redemptive stories, they kind of go together. There's this sort of something about how they fit, and they fit maybe pretty tightly in our society, in American society. Maybe they wouldn't fit so tightly in a different society where you might have other go-to cultural narratives that would support a highly generative adult. But I think you have generativity across the board. It's a universal. People in all societies need to take care of the next generation. You get variation on that. That's a universal. The redemptive self-story, I don't know how universal that is. I think certain features of it might be, but my guess is that highly generative adults in, say, France, their life stories differ from the life stories of less generative adults, but probably not along the lines we're seeing here. There may be some other kind of cultural overlay there. That's an open question, though. I think I might be out of time, but is somebody in charge, aside from me? I'm out of time. Okay, thank you all very much.